Disclaimer: this video deals heavily with topics of death, suicide, and various mental health issues. If these are topics which are triggering to you, I recommend you click off this video. If you or someone you know is struggling with their mental health and well-being, there is help. I'll be leaving some resources for where you can find it in the description of this video. You matter. Thank you. I Didn't Mean to Haunt You is an incredible album. Created entirely by the 22-year-old Ben Losky, or Quadeca, a hip-hop artist who has been putting out music for over 8 years now, which is especially impressive considering his young age. He has also had quite the metamorphosis over those 8 years, from being considered a part of the YouTube rap scene.
My school has banned me from making this track,
to creating some of the most impressive experimental music of 2022. In this video, I will not be talking about the metamorphosis much outside of the conclusion, as I would like to mostly focus on I Didn't Mean to Haunt You, and why I consider it to be one of my favorite records of all time. The album tells a story of a person who has passed away, talking from the perspective of the ghost. It describes the ghost's journey through afterlife, finding out what it is, and coming to terms with it. It is a posthumous album from the perspective of the deceased, and it takes full advantage of that concept, with a ton of creative and clever writing, which I will be talking about a ton throughout this video. The album is quite difficult to categorize, as it features many incredible genre blends of ambient music, indie, emo folk, hip-hop, rap, and even hard rock, all of it with a grand, cinematic presentation full of string sections and gorgeous arpeggios. Quadeca describes the album as somewhat biographic, meaning it is told from his perspective, as if it was his passing, but the ghost is kind of a character of its own.
And the album, it's not really, it's like somewhat biographical, like it's somewhat from my perspective, but it's also a character.
Quadeca is still alive, and he actually described the album as an artistic way of taking control over his own thoughts of suicidal ideation.
Like I was talking to my friend Rosie about I have OCD in making music or just in life in general, and he was like, do you think that your OCD kind of contributed to you wanting to, you don't like to have things out of your control? Like, do you feel like this album was kind of you taking death and like suicide into your own hands and like having agency over that in a very like existential way? And I think that that's kind of true. That's kind of what it was.
In some ways, I would compare the album to Petscop. It isn't nearly as vague, and the story of the record can be pretty clearly seen if you read into it. Where the similarities come in, however, is that the spirit of this record also is in the details. It is one of those albums that you get more out of with repeated listens, finding out little details and becoming more and more familiar with its story and concept. I've heard the album numerous times, and there are still lines which I'm yet to make heads or tails of.
Because I was really trying to make it a kind of album where if you are a fan of the album, it's like a rewarding experience to be a fan of it, because there's so much to break down if you care and if you have the time to do it.
A lot of the shots in this video are also going to be taken from the I Didn't Mean to Haunt You album movie, which I will not be talking about in much detail as it isn't related to the central story, but which is a gorgeous visual representation of the record, which I would recommend you check out. This video is also merely my interpretation of the album. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is what I take from it, not necessarily what Quadeca intended, or what the most likely meaning is. What I would like to do here is go through the album track by track, focusing on what stands out to me, both lyrically and instrumentally, and why it is the best record I have heard in 2022. An interesting thing to note right at the beginning is that it isn't stated anywhere in the beginning of this record that Quadeca took his own life. However, it is the only reasonable explanation, as there is a ton of reflection as to why he did it, and there isn't any blame on anybody or anything else for taking his life. I appreciate the subtlety of it. Whilst it is an album about a dead person, the death itself isn't the primary focus. It is mostly focused on the feelings that come before and after it, putting it in a much broader perspective. Sorry for Dying is the opening track to the album, starting off with a lo-fi synth pattern, which will be reoccurring throughout the album as a sort of instrumental symbol. It quickly turns to some grandiose synthesized horns, which I believe represent the sort of glorification of death, which led Quadeca to ending his life on this album. It is the feeling that death is something to aspire to, or to look forward to as a saving point.
You know, I started having this growing like suicidal ideation, which it was kind of in a weird way, or I don't know if it was in a weird way, but I this idea of like not existing kind of became almost like a comforting, happy place in my mind, you know, like a sort of like not in a woe is me depressed kind of way, but in like this, like one day I'll get to it kind of thing.
This is going to become a little clearer once I get deeper into the album, but it also is a reoccurring theme. The horns then suddenly cut to a simple piano pattern, with Quadeca rapping with a ton of distortion on his vocals.
Come to think about it, it's all in my head. Fuel tank blink, it's been running in the red.
There are tons of effects used on his voice all over the record, which is meant to give you the kind of ghostly feeling. It's been running in the red.
Someone said, calm down, this ain't not a stand. Somewhere I got stuck, it's in my hand.
Quadeca seems to be coming to terms with the fact he is now dead, describing the depressing reality he felt stuck in before ending his life, talking about how everything he wanted was never in the plans, which is a lyric I identified with very strongly. It isn't so much the case right now, but I'm pretty familiar with the feeling of things you enjoy feeling out of reach, or feeling very secondary to everything else.
And now it's hard to think. I've been running in and out of dreams, repeat, and everything you ever say, see in me.
This is also a great lyric, referring to the sense of disorientation when you feel like what you want to do can't be accomplished, simply clinging on to what other people see in you as you can't find your own joy and self-worth. Quadeca then goes on to describe himself passing through the walls of his own house and leaving his body behind. The gorgeous lo-fi hook sees him talking about how he is not the one. Which is an interesting and perhaps unintended contrast with an opening track to his album Voice Memos, Ego Death, where he is very grateful for believing in himself and believing he is the one.
So when they say you got an ego, tell them thank the fucking Lord, cause if you didn't, you'd be suffering, you'd be stuck there on the floor with nothing more.
His rambling about his loved ones has a very messy melody, which actually works itself really naturally into the track.
Sorry for dying. I just wanna hold you.
The song closes itself out with a drum pattern which feels somehow very tribal, in spite of clearly being created synthetically. It feels like a ritual of Quadeca's ghost leaving his body. Over these drums, he repeatedly chants, "Next thing you know," which I believe very simplistically talks about how we all have certain expectations of what happens after death, and yet once you die, the next thing you know is you're in the strange world we are about to explore. Tell Me a Joke was one of the two singles for the album, a somewhat cynical ballad, feeling as if Quadeca's entire life was just one big joke.
Man walked in the wall,
The song almost feels as if the ghost is refusing to believe any of this is actually happening, along with the "come to think about it, it's all in my head" on the previous song. The track features a pretty guitar pattern along with some distorted, gentle singing and rapping. Laughing at you, I had so many things left to do, sounds like Quadeca beginning to feel regret over what he'd done. How am I doing this? Bone dry skeleton humorous. Brings back the feeling the ghost is still in disbelief. On the chorus, he talks about crickets, which plays well into the common theme of him having different and somewhat grand expectations of afterlife. Yet once he died, all he could hear were the crickets, with nobody being able to interact with him or hear his jokes. It plays into the slightly more biographical feeling of the album too, with Quadeca being an entertainer. The second verse hits us with one of the greatest lines on the album. How could it be? It's a setup, the punchline was me. Quadeca describing his entire life as merely a setup for something that didn't happen, his suicide being the punchline. The chorus also has a somewhat old-timey vibe to it, as if it was played on an old turntable, in spite of sounding relatively clean. The song closes out with a very interesting outro with tons of distorted bass, which unfortunately doesn't hit as hard as I feel it could have, and it's still a pretty strong ending. If I wanted to really defend it, I would say that the bass represents a sort of frustration and anger inside of the ghost, but he's not able to properly articulate it or let it out, as his form and his attachment to this world is slowly getting weaker and weaker. Don't Mind Me is a very cinematic cut, filled with synthesizers, strings, and slow build-ups of instrumentation. The ghost describes himself as being somewhere in between, talking about his loved ones, going through old pictures of him, feeling as if he's somewhere in between being alive and being merely a picture. He describes what I believe to be his mother looking for closure, thinking he's in heaven, whilst he's right behind her and she simply can't see him. She's seen going through all of the old remains of him, piecing them together. He describes it as a souvenir version of me, which she afterwards puts up in the attic. He sounds desperate talking about it, as if she was actually piecing him back to life. Or at least as if he was wishing she could. He also talks about running out of space in the attic where the souvenir had been stored. I believe this is a recurring theme of Quadeca being a ghost, not having a body anymore, being merely a cluster of thoughts and willpower. He's not able to control his own form, as he doesn't have one anymore, and as a result he's expanding, becoming a part of the world as opposed to somebody living in it. The chorus of this track reminds me a little bit of From Me to You, being somewhat glitchy and glitzy, with some nice, choppy bass hits. Afterwards, we are greeted with an absolutely gorgeous orchestral outro, with vibrating strings, piano arpeggios, and glitchy bass making it all feel incredibly unique. It is a very heavenly moment, feeling as if you were ascending onto another plane of existence, which is a surprisingly fitting description for this record. The last verse is mostly a subdued version of the verse before, with an added line that reads, "I will help you on the other side," with Quadeca wanting to help his family once they pass his way of giving back. The song fades out into more beautiful strings, and ends on a sample of "It Is Well With My Soul," a Christian hymn by Horatio Spafford. It is a mantra of finding peace within God, which could mean a whole bunch of things, from Quadeca feeling at peace with himself in that moment, to his family playing the song in their home as a way of dealing with grief. I believe it is mostly a thematic inclusion, a vague gesture to afterlife, and a pretty sample. The original song actually sounds quite similar to some of the layered vocals on the album. It is most likely a point of inspiration in some way, as Quadeca has cited Lingua Ignota, an incredibly talented Christian vocalist, as one of his main inspirations for the record. Picking Up Hand starts off with the same synth pattern as the entire album, but this time it is a little more distorted, which I believe symbolizes the ghost losing its form. It goes into more guitar patterns, along with distorted ramblings about being born from the perspective of a soul entering the body.
Pick up my
Being covered in skin is a very interesting description you can really only use once you're a soul without a body. Throughout the track, the vocals get more distorted, sounding somewhat demented, over an instrumental which doesn't sound like a country song, yet it illustrates the imagery of an old cottage in the woods very well somehow.
Same carpet I crawled in, same bucket I was washed in. I gave all the time to it, I was trying to figure out the faucets.
Over this instrumental, Quadeca reminisces on his childhood, trying to figure out the world he had been placed in.
Same basket you carry me, I need you there with me, I need you just that
One lyric which stuck out to me was the lyric on the chorus talking about tall marks on the wall charts. It's the wrong parts getting longer. On one hand, it doesn't seem too far off for this to be a line about penis size. On the other hand, it could be a more general idea of feeling out of place in one's body. This is most likely just a coincidence, but if I was describing growing up as trans, this could quite likely be one of the lyrics I would use. It is also a slight stretch, but imagining somebody growing up and feeling like all of their body is just a little disproportionate for them is a really grim image, which might not be intentional, but fits into the themes of the record really well.
I looked up and down, didn't want to make a sound. I was so far away, I don't want to go another day.
The ghost also talks about being terrified and not being able to get its feelings out, feeling paralyzed inside and not being able to climb like it used to.
I was staring at the ceiling, I was fucking terrified. I was trying to get these feelings out of sight, I'm paralyzed.
Some people interpret this as him seeing the ceiling of his own coffin, but tied together with the lines about gravity, I believe these are more so memories of perhaps traumatic signs of his decline earlier on in his life. The signs were there, but he didn't know how to deal with them.
Same bucket I was washed in, I gave all the time to it, I was trying to figure out the faucets.
After the chorus, we slowly transition into a gorgeous indie instrumental. The track kind of sounds like a cleaner version of some songs from the Weather Day album.
Back at last, and
This was perhaps an unintentional reference, but there are also mentions of Lazarus' skin in this portion of the song, which could be referring to David Bowie's song Lazarus, a song Bowie released only a few days before his death. The spoken word outro to this song is very distorted. I'm not sure I would be able to make out what it is without reading it, but it is a talk about the expectations of a sort of consolation prize after death, an explanation of what this life was all about.
Unspoken agreements that make perfect sense until you say them out loud.
It's a really interesting idea. We as humans often try to peek behind the curtain and see what happens after death. Sometimes so much so we forget to focus on our own lives. This monologue makes it feel as if life was more about the journey than the destination, which is something I actually identify with quite strongly. It is quite a positive message you can dig up in the midst of all this gloomy imagery, that perhaps the prize could simply be being alive. It reminds me ever so slightly of the Bo Burnham song From God's Perspective, where he talks about life on earth being heaven, and not sacrificing your life to get to heaven. Born Yesterday was the first single released from the album, and it is a really interesting turning point for the record. So far, we have been slowly reminiscing along with the ghost, sliding deeper and deeper into this strange, mellow mood. Born Yesterday feels like we have entered the real teary-eyed moments of the record, as it fully focuses on the ghost watching his mother move on after his death. The track has a really interesting structure. No songs here really operate on the most basic verse, chorus, bridge pattern, but this track in particular combines together the verses, choruses, and bridges, mushing it all together in a very mesmerizing way, which somehow still works.
I was kind of approaching each song like an episode of TV or something. Like every song has an arc to it, and it needs to go from here to here. And I want it to feel, each song to feel like a story and also contribute to the overall story of the album. I wasn't thinking consciously of like what genres I needed it to be, but I was just like, what does this need to like feel like, and what does this need to do in order to go from here to here? And that's kind of how I approached the songs, and without a real conscious thing of, oh, I'm gonna do a rap section here, I'm gonna do a fucking shoegaze thing here and a witch house synth. You know, I was just kind of like, how am I gonna communicate this story? And I just really spent a long time creating the soundscapes for it and just doing something that felt unique and felt like you're not gonna get that from any other album, you know? Just approaching every song in that very specific and story-based immersive way just kind of allows you to play with a bunch of stuff, and it will come together in a weirdly cohesive way.
This track starts off with a very distorted, high-pitched guitar pattern, as well as gentle chants of I wasn't born yesterday.
I wasn't born yesterday. I think you're goddamn right. I wasn't born yesterday. I think you're goddamn right.
The track also features a very distorted sample of the Beatles song For No One, which is a heartbroken old-timey ballad talking about a love dying. It really highlights the beauty of sampling, recontextualizing what used to be simply a song about a summer love ending, to making it about somebody's mother moving on after their death. The first verse features him talking about his mother reminiscing on his passing. She's imagining he's somewhere out there having a birthday party, when he's right there, and not in a better place at all. The second verse absolutely fascinates me with its strange beat, an instrumental which shouldn't make sense if you listen closely to what is going on inside of it, yet it works beautifully.
Now I'm here. I've been in so many tears, I try my best not to count it. I've been in so many hearts, I've been in so many prayers, I've been in so many couches.
It would seem Quadeca talks a bit about his career as a musician here, talking about how he's been in so many houses, prayers and couches, as his music has gotten into so many places, whilst his fanbase has been praying for him. It is also an interesting thing to note that his fanbase or his music career aren't too notably mentioned on this album. I don't want to suggest that Quadeca doesn't care about his fans or anything like that. I more so feel like this album really highlights what is truly important in one's life and goes much deeper than things such as fame, money, or even usual life's problems. He also talks about how, in spite of him wanting his family to move on and not grieve anymore, he's trying to unsee how his mother moved on, as it feels wrong that she's letting go of him, and he doesn't even feel real anymore. I've been ripped from the floor, the umbilical cord is still sort of around me. Feels like a lyric referring to how, even though he has been ripped away from life, it still feels like a child learning to live in a completely different world, having little to no idea of how it works, or what has even happened. A well-placed thought right after the track picking up hands. The umbilical cord could also be referring to a rope he hung himself with, which has been left there. The second chorus hits us with more chants of Born Yesterday, before dropping into a huge drum beat, which somehow still sounds really mellow and subdued. The third verse goes effortlessly over that same drum beat, though with Quadeca's vocals now being more overcompressed than anywhere else on the album, adding some ghostly crackling to the performance. He talks about losing the perception of time from the sadness, about how it's been 12 nights since he passed, but it felt like a million years. He also talks about how his mother said it happened for a reason, but he feels like she's lying to him, and there is no point of him being here. That weight gets heavy when I'm breathing is a lyric that also stuck out to me, because it kind of reminded me of some experiences I've had, moments when I depersonalize and can't really tell what I'm feeling. I have to face it afterwards, even though it's still in the background and making me somewhat miserable. I interpret this lyric as the ghost not being able to process emotions anymore, not being equipped the right way for it, that the pain only comes back when he's breathing and clinging on to life. It might not even be related to the ghost. Going through the terrifying posthumous experiences we've been talking about so far, it could simply be its mental state falling apart. The bridge on the track is absolutely gorgeous, with what sounds like genuine tears coming through Quadeca's layered vocals, crying about all of the things he should have done while still alive. He talks about being free if you just save the date, which is referring to a lyric earlier on in the track about how he keeps on circling dates and thinking about it, talking about self-improvement and things he wanted to do he kept putting off in his depressed state. That same sentence being said on this track could be referring to how this is what it's haunting the ghost itself, that idea of improving, that it never filled out. If he would have done it earlier, he wouldn't have died. He wishes he could have done it, but feeling like he couldn't figure out how to outrun himself.
I just a hint of doubt. I wish I let that hint become me. Just a little doubt. Can figure out how to outrun me.
The bridge ends off with a very cathartic, strong moment of regret.
It's all those little things. I should have said out loud.
The song slowly breaks down, with sounds that feel like a building being torn down, with massive bass hits, rumbling synthesizers, and lots of echo. In a sense, it reminds me of the sound of Quadeca's previous record, From Me to You.
We gon' put in work until it work out. All these hoes be in my face, she got her ass out, she gon' put in work.
On that record, the instrumentals were also huge, but every sound was clear and impactful. Here, there's much more going on, and it all falls together much more naturally. There usually isn't a focus on a singular instrument, but rather on the atmosphere all of it creates together. The Memories We Lost in Translation is a very short interlude, only about a minute in length. It is kind of an extension of Born Yesterday, with just a few lines of the ghost toxically blaming its mother for not getting the rest he expected. If Born Yesterday were the ghost's last moments before falling into complete desperation, how settling is that desperation personified in song? This track features one of the few features on the record, the iconic rapper Danny Brown. How settling itself is a really interesting metaphor for 3 to 4 different things.
He's like settling into his family's old home, like desperate at this point to make his presence known and for them to see him and, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But whatever he does to get their attention, they just write it off as house settling, you know, like creaks in the floor, you know, cracks and shit or whatever. Like, it's kind of a little play on words because it's, you know, he's literally settling into the house, but it's also like this old house that's settling, you know, like carbon monoxide leaks are a common symptom of houses when they're settling, and carbon monoxide leaks are also a very common cause of ghost sightings.
The song starts off surprisingly calmly, talking about getting shit straight.
First things first, can we get shit straight? I've been alone since you left me in your wake. I've been alone to reflect on my mistakes. I've been alone since when...
Even through the calm synth patterns, the lyrics have a very ominous tone, talking about the ghost begging its family to not breathe in, and yelling at them from a distance.
From a distance, could you tell when you let me see it?
But there are also somewhat comforting lyrics of the ghost settling into the house, cuddling up in a vase on the shelf.
Put my feet on the floor, always, every boy, heard it creep, turn it weak, turn the heat up some more.
The pretty instrumental quickly falls apart as we enter the first chorus, filled with haunting and desperate chants. The second verse feels a lot more real and scary, with imagery of dents in the rug, frames hiding the suicide that happened here, and aging cytosol, which is the fluid that fills up body cells. All of this points to the marks of the ghost's death not even being cleaned up properly. The second chorus is this time filled with chants of death to me. The ghost feeling as if their family already felt dead to them, since they can't see them or interact with them at all. It feels like the ghost's selfishness really coming in. The ghost is the person who chose to leave, and now it's blaming them for staying alive and not being able to see him.
It's this moment of realization for the character that it's like he's been pretty self-centered. You know, like it's all about I'm going through this and da-da-da-da and me and me and me and me.
Finally, they find a way to make themselves seen as words the family sees through carbon monoxide. It knows what it's doing, but doesn't know what it's about to cause, as the track goes into a psychotic verse from Danny Brown, rapping from the perspective of carbon monoxide as it poisons and suffocates the entire family. The instrumental on this part is particularly noisy, amazingly fusing heavy bass hits, as well as what I believe to be 8-bit noise, which somehow creates a very emotive background for Benny Brown to go insane over. Knots is a very unique track in the I Didn't Mean to Haunt You tracklist. It still fits into the concept, but it is an absolutely manic banger. It is still quite far away from it, but it is the closest we get to a straightforward rap track on this album. In terms of emotional impact, it isn't as strong as songs like Born Yesterday or House Settling, but it is incredibly anxiety-inducing.
And so I just wanted something that really felt like a fucking panic attack, that felt like digging through a fucking knot in your chest, you know? Like the synths and stuff kind of swirl around in a really dissonant way. The end of that song, that's probably my favorite part of it, is the end with that really fucking weird synth thing and the drums that are just all over the place. Like, it really sounds like a fucking, I don't know, it just felt like how I needed like guilt to sound.
In terms of being an absolutely manic banger though, it is amazing, combining rap, punk, indie, and hard rock in a way that really works. The title of the song is also its theme, various nods, things that weigh heavy on the ghost's consciousness that they've been describing to us this entire time.
It's a lot about guilt, and it's a lot about sort of overcoming like those internal things that you know that choke you up, or you know, the character of the album feels overcome with guilt, and the people in the real world that he's trying to interact with are also going through their own knots, and that's kind of like a key turning phase.
Everything from the grief and fear they had to deal with this whole time, to the death of their loved ones they caused. This track features one of my favorite lines from the entire album, "I'm an open book in a closed casket," which is repeated throughout the entire song. There are many other similarly depressed and dark lyrics throughout the track, such as, "It's like lassoing ocean waves when I try to hold back my tears." A great lyrical moment is the ghost describing itself as a glitch, talking about people stuttering when they get to its name, struggling to talk about them knowing what has happened. The second chorus builds up with a stirring synthesizer, with an occasional rumble of an electric guitar, when this chorus is absolutely insane. I would never expect Quadeca to be somebody to make me headbang this hard to a track. I Don't Fade to Black, I Cut to Static is a reference to a concept which begins to really shine through in the last leg of the album, which begins to explain why the album feels so noisy.
Throughout the album, there's a lot of like static elements, there's a lot of dropouts, a lot of grain, and what that contributes to the, you know, textural sort of ghostly lo-fi aesthetic of the songs, but it's also like a very intentionally conceptual choice to kind of have grain and static representing like the eternal light of beyond, you know?
This lyric could also be a reference to the Quadeca song Work, talking about how he needs his credit before he fades to black.
But I'm okay with dirt on my name. If it helps to make it last, I pray for that. I need my credit before the fade to black. Yeah.
There's a lyric on here talking about having to turn the oven off here as well, referring to the carbon monoxide incident. The third verse features what sound like sampled church bells and very chaotic drums. It sounds absolutely insane. I need to really commend Quadeca's technical abilities here, as this seems incredibly difficult to rap over. There is a sweet detail on the lyric, ever since the two sides turn into the one side, with the panning going from one side to the center. It reminds me of the MF Doom track Money Folder, where a similar touch adds a lot to the track. There are some very smart lyrics here too, such as "Knots like a fisherman hooked me in with one bite," which is most likely a reference to biting dust. "Not doing this again, thinking about that one night" is the closing lyric of the track, talking about the ghost not wanting to go back to life, thinking about the night they chose to take it. The song also ends off with some very distorted spoken word. This seems to be the ghost talking about wanting to see their life again, further reinforcing them thinking back to the night they took their life, which is talked about in the next song, Fantasy World. Fantasy World is arguably the best track on the album. It is a 7-minute ballad, and it starts off where Knots left us. These are the ghost's thoughts about that one night it all happened.
Cry to sleep, wait a week again. Oh, amen.
As a result, the vocals here are actually mixed very cleanly compared to the rest of the record, as Quadeca was still alive at this point in the timeline.
You know, boy, I could be so much more than I am.
He talks about the fantasy world, where he wants to go.
I need to go. I heard there's a place for me, one that nobody knows.
It is somewhat ominous, hearing him talk about wanting to go to a place he seems to also know isn't real.
So I drove mountains away to a place that ain't real.
But that fear is quickly drowned out with Quadeca describing all of the safe spots in his life, and how he's hoping to revisit them in the afterlife.
It's your mom's bakery in Maine. It's that cabin in Sweden. It's the going offline. It's next year I'll go vegan.
For a moment, the song fades into that same synth pattern from the beginning, sounding very clean. The chorus simply explodes afterwards. It is amazing. It sounds so lo-fi, yet grandiose, with so many sounds clashing together as Quadeca excitedly talks about leaving. It leads me back to that sort of glorious sound at the beginning of the record. Suicide feels like a victory lap here. The last words we can hear from him talk about him going to the fantasy world, without a rush or a care in the world.
And I found
We can hear the ghostly effects creeping in as his life is taken away. The track then goes into a lengthy ambient outro, which feels like him slowly entering the real afterlife, feeling lost and afraid. We can hear the howling, bringing us back to reality, alone and in the dark. The song's placement is really good. It couldn't have been the opener, even though chronologically it did happen at the start. Knowing what we know, the song is horrifying and lets us see things way more panoramically than the protagonist can. We know his life after death is going to be very painful and tragic, but in that absolutely gorgeous minute or so, we can easily forget about it, getting so consumed by the euphoric ideas, even though deep down we know they are not real. It goes back to the intro track with its glorious horns. With the movie which is released along with the album, we can see Quadeca at the start, walking towards that cabin in Sweden. Yet before he can enter it, the footage cuts to a misty lake, showing us the true afterlife.
Come to think about it, it's all in my head.
The album gives us that one blissful moment right as he is about to die, but it also shows us what happens after, and through that reflects on what has been going on for a while before that moment came. Fractions of Infinity has another one of the few features on the record, that being the Sunday Service Choir, known for working with people the likes of Kanye West. The title, Fractions of Infinity, refers to people. As humans, we often feel very insignificant, as if we are essentially pointless compared to the massive size of the universe. The song takes a more positive and cathartic point of view on it, describing all humans as fractions of something greater, of the universe which wouldn't exist without all of its little details it is made out of. The song works as a sort of peaceful ending to the story. It is still very emotional, but it feels like after going through its notes and being able to see what actually happened, the ghost can finally see everything a little more clearly, realizing what it needs to do.
Been afraid of nothing for so long. That's why I'm stuck with it.
It talks about how hard it is for it to hide, running away from the light, referring to Born Yesterday, talking about how it gets so bright I disappear. When it loses focus, it feels like the light is going to consume it. It also feels afraid of the divine, which is going to judge it and punish it for what it's done. This could also be a reference to how ghosts are mostly seen at night, hiding away from the light in day. It is a very original take on the idea. The track features a gorgeous indie chorus, which once again reminds me of a cleaner version of somebody like Weather Day. In the second verse, the ghost talks about being afraid of nothing, and that carrying over to its afterlife. The light doesn't bring punishment, it brings nothing, peace, which it was so afraid to accept.
Been afraid of nothing for so long. That's why I'm stuck with it. But nothing is gonna change until I change what nothing is in it.
The bridge is intersected with the last verse, and it brings a real conclusion to the record.
Those words don't do you justice. I see my life inside your hands. Once cave in, we start to play.
The ghost sings about hearing a voice without a face when it misses its mother. She doesn't have a body or a face anymore. All she is a howl in the wind.
Face. And every time I'm with you, the clock hands wave me out of place.
This lyric stands out to me the most, talking about the ghost falling apart as time goes on, but only really feeling comfortable enough to accept that with its mother. It feels as if all that is left of it is a prayer, and then its life is going to be over.
I see all I ever understand. When it's just another way. I think I hit my target weight. Got exercise while I stood in place. Got every time that I couldn't trace.
The ghost has been trying to make sense of afterlife, but now seems to be accepting it in a more how things are way, simply because it's what feels right. There is a really nice double entendre, the ghost hitting its target weight, which is essentially 0. This could be a reference to an eating disorder, though that seems unlikely at this point in the record, but it also talks about exorcism, people trying to erase it from their lives. This could be referencing the divided divinity which is talked about on the pre-chorus, but I believe it is referencing the people it has haunted, not being able to get rest, feeling hurt by the ghost and wanting it to go away. It also keeps getting hurt by staying present in everyone's lives. I essentially imagine it trying to haunt more people, but I can see the bags under their eyes, and their fear something is going to go wrong next. The occasional based on what still sounds like the ghost trying to fight for itself, but it is beginning to give up.
Based on what? Living up projected screens that let the screaming cut. Based on what? Take 23, let's get the scene and be enough.
The final lyrics talk about the ghost's life as a movie, which is a very beautiful way to end it off, talking about the director's screaming cut as the movie, the life, has theoretically already ended, but is still continuing on in a weird, disruptive way. It talks about this being take 23, which could be referring to Quadeca being 22. The ghost could have stayed around until its next birthday.
Throw some grain on if you can, and that is that. I'm in that space between your hands about to clap. Those walls are caving in and they say congratulations, that's a wrap.
I absolutely love the idea of there being a sense of congratulations, no matter how the ghost has lived its life. It isn't a congratulations for the suicide, but for coming to terms with what has happened, and being able to finally let go. The outro of the track is taken over by the Sunday service choir, repeating a simple but effective mantra of, "Those words don't do you justice."
Those words don't do you justice. Those words don't do you justice.
It's a very beautiful mantra, most likely how the ghost feels, feeling as if words will never do it, or its mother justice. If you're merely a soul, you most likely see what a person is very differently to somebody living inside of a body.
Those words don't do you justice.
With the choir laughing and smiling, I like to imagine them being able to hear the ghost and helping it deliver a message to its mother. The music can take its message beyond words. It is a bit out there, but I like seeing it that way. With that, we have arrived at the end of the record now, at Cassini's Division. Cassini's Division is the dark space between the two rings of Saturn. I believe the two rings represent life and death. The ghost has been inhabiting the space in between the two, and is now about to go through a division, being filtered out as it reaches the other side. The track is more of an outro than a standalone track, featuring lots of spoken word over a very ghastly instrumental. It also features Thor Harris, of Swan's fame, on drums.
341. You came out of the room and you were crying in a way that nobody could hear. I stopped kicking and screaming when you turned the lights on. You woke me up. I felt naked, I felt exposed, I felt like for the first time I was intruding on something.
I believe this is describing the moment when its mom came into the room. I was intruding on something was most likely a feeling that has been there since the very start. That feeling that it's not supposed to be around anymore. It feels like his mom getting him out of the noise, in spite of what he has done. It's a beautiful moment.
That presence that I've tried so hard to be ignored. There was business. Regardless of whether or not I was.
What it has lived will live on in some way, no matter what it does.
You were showing me that. I wasn't blinded by the light, but everything else.
It was blinded by trying to make its presence known, in spite of trying to reach peace this entire time, which could not have been found if it kept on trying to hide away from it. This monologue pulls inspiration from what I believe to be Hinduism, as well as meditation, the belief that enlightenment is reached through having no thoughts. Meditation is a real method, based on trying to keep your thoughts aside, meaning this entire idea isn't completely out there.
That's why all we want is peace. All we want is to stop thinking. All we want is this enlightened silence. It's in our code. That's why it's also ironic. Maybe that's the punchline.
The ghost is finally coming to terms with the cynical struggles of Tell Me You Joke on here as well.
So, let me go. Let me go and don't let go of me.
There's a beautiful image here of the ghost letting go of its mom, knowing she will still be there, just like him, whether they will still be able to realize it, or simply be a part of that void.
I've been trying to move past the crack wounds and dust scratches, but that's what I am, you know? An accidental side effect of an online canvas. Think about that glowing dust that destroys the night sky's dream of just being nothing.
There's a lot of imagery here in general, including the idea that humans are like stars, beautiful, but made to be in the way. There is a video of the song Sorry for Dying overlaid with an old cartoon on the Quadeca Exclusives channel, which makes me imagine Quadeca and his mom as these cartoons floating in the sky.
The static that floods every room stacks on top of itself until it blocks out the picture. Maybe that's the perfect board that's begging me to join in, begging me to let you go without letting go of you. So I can make that void just a little bit brighter when you see it. Until next time.
The song closes off, going into a driving drum pattern from Thor Harris as one last goodbye, before fading out into static and white noise that takes up the last 4 minutes of the album. There's some wonderful recontextualization at play here, using simple white noise to convey so much emotion. And with that, we have now gone through the entirety of I Didn't Mean to Haunt You. I Didn't Mean to Haunt You is an incredible album, which I would recommend to anyone who is willing to dig just a little bit beneath the surface of it. The concept is executed pretty much flawlessly, outside of a few instrumental spots I didn't care too much for. It is a sad record, yet it brings a sense of peace with many beautiful messages and mental images. To me, it is an artist going through the ideas of death and saying, it's not time to go yet. It also explores the idea of the sort of enlightening silence, and letting go in a very interesting way. It made me personally appreciate the silence in my life a lot more. I cried my heart out to this album numerous times. I can't see calling it anything but a 10 out of 10 experience. One last thing I would like to talk about before I go is the fascinating story behind this album, which I have explored quite a bit whilst doing research for this video, and which has been very inspiring to me as a young artist. As I have said in the introduction of this video, Quadeca has been known for a long time as simply a YouTube rapper, rapping really fast with some clever lines, being kind of a cornball, and collaborating with rappers the likes of Crypt or Dax.
When I rap on the track, it lasts. When you rap aloud, you ask, and that's facts.
That's facts. Hello, I'm back on the track. I put the universe back on the map.
Even before the release of I Didn't Mean to Haunt You, it wouldn't be too difficult to see Quadeca had what it takes to make an amazing project, with a not perfect, but incredibly ambitious record that was From Me to You.
I'm the only one who else should have your name. Fall in love until it's not the same. If you lost me, don't you take the blame.
But going back through his career, and through various interviews about this, as well as a few previous records, it is pretty clear the seeds of I Didn't Mean to Haunt You have always been there.
But I love doing those choir vocals.
Yeah,
Those
I could tell.
I love the way those sound. And I've been doing that on my music since I was like 14, to varying degrees of success. But whenever I did that, I was like, oh, I love that.
I feel like sort of what made me a little bit
like sort of an interesting artist even back then. Was like sort of combining my background and like playing the piano and being sort of just like more of like a traditional musician and putting that with hip hop lyrics and flows. And
like I genuinely believe that I can make really cool shit, and I think I am just sort of getting started with, you know, at a phase where I think I have like enough self-awareness and taste now to start really like going ham and you know, not feeling imposter syndrome or like and stuff like that. Like I now feel sort of worthy to be the artist that I you know want to be, and I still have a lot of room to grow and whatnot.
In these interviews, Quadeca often brings up how, ever since he was 10, he was making piano ballads.
So, like my first videos, I was like 9 and 10.
Okay.
And they were all like me playing the piano, like singing like some Adele type shit.
Wow.
Like, because, you know, we'll get into the whole YouTube rapper lane in a second.
But so
like,
you were always into music?
Oh yeah, I was always a musician first.
I've always been, like since I was a kid, I was a musician, and I would play songs on the piano and sing them like sort of in an Adele, like Regina Spektor type thing, you know?
I would love to hear that. I would love to.
Hell yeah. But that was actually the first YouTube content I was ever making, was like me being 10 years old, doing these sort of piano ballad, you know, songs.
Even before that, he's had an electric guitar when he was little, which is something that I believe came through on the track Not.
When I had a little like mini electric guitar, and my first album, this is a little, you're getting a lot of exclusives here, but it was like me playing on this like big electric guitar. I was like tiny. Every time I strummed the guitar, it would shake my body. My voice, it was like,
There were many talks of him balancing seeking approval and virality with his artistic vision, and always wanting to create something more ambitious.
I did a lot of thinking and a lot of like, reevaluating like my whole perspective on like clout and where I wanted to go, and I was like, I'm just gonna focus on this album and just being myself, you know. So, and I think that actually really paid off, because like my feedback from my album, I feel like has been I feel like it's more overwhelming than even the diss track.
So part of me wants to just do that and like, you know, drop banger videos and stuff like that, and then the other part of me wants to move to a shack in Norway and just work on some weird, dope music that is probably going to be more fulfilling.
It feels like on this record, the ambition has fully taken over, with Quadeca not seeking any form of approval from the outside world, and simply looking to make an amazing record. Whilst this album didn't, it most likely wouldn't even be able to reach an audience as wide as singles such as Uh-huh or Beamin'. It wasn't meant to, and instead it has become a long-lasting and impressive piece of art. It is a record putting together all of his life as an artist, telling an inspiring story, and dealing with his own thoughts of suicidal ideation at the same time. It's inspiring to see. This is a very personal feeling I got listening to the record, but I also want to get it out there. I write my own horror stories sometimes, and often I get very immersed in the story, occasionally getting scared my characters and what I'm writing about is actually real. Funnily enough, I have an entire book I might publish someday about the idea of afterlife, and some strange ideas I have about what might happen once we pass away. When it comes out in the future, I would like to know that it was written long before this record came out, and the idea for it came from a completely different place. If it ever comes down to it, you heard it here first. But my point is that I would love to know what it felt like to record this album. There were so many spots where Quadeca was clearly feeling what the ghost, in a sense he himself, was going through. And I would love to know what having that sense of immersion for an entire record must have felt like. And that is all I have to say about this album. Give it a try. Feel free to let me know about any thoughts you might have about it. And make sure everything you want is in your plans. Goodbye.